Now, one of the really nice things about a sailboat is that when you get tired of the view from your back porch, you can change the view.
We had again anchored our Pearson 36 cutter Freelance in the secluded back basin of Chippewa Harbor at Isle Royale. It's such a beautiful and peaceful place, which Vicki and I always enjoy exploring by dinghy. It's a deep inlet surrounded by lush boreal forest and high hills, which offers great protection from the weather out of the open lake. As I've often said, it can blow gale out there, and you would hardly know it when you're anchored in here. Regardless, there certainly wasn't any adverse weather at Isle Royale on this particular sunny summer day, and we felt free to leisurely follow along the rocky shoreline and into the cove at the basin's eastern end, all the while taking in the beautiful scenery.
If you saw a moose here, that would be the most likely place.
And there wasn't any moose, so we curved around to where a rocky point separates the cove from the channel to Chippewa's eastern basin. The channel has about 9 to 10 feet of water down the middle. Of course, that's when Lake Superior is at chart data, and at this time it was up about a foot. This cove is where most boaters choose to anchor in the outer basin. The creek, which connects with Lake Ritchie, has brought enough mud and other materials downstream to make an underwater shelf suitable for anchoring. But the depth from the shelf suddenly drops steeply to more than 50 feet, so you have to be careful about where you choose to set your hook. What you see on the shoreline is a wreck of an old fishing tug. Before Isle Royale was made into a national park in 1940, it had many thriving commercial fishing communities, locally called camps, and one of them was established here at Chippewa Harbor. It even had a store. Except for the old tug and a tiny house, officially referred to as a former schoolhouse, everything else is gone, and what you have now is a campground and a popular dock. All the docks at Isle Royale National Park are on a first-come, first-served basis. Reservations are not possible. However, an official rule is that if someone has established use of one of the campground shelters and temporarily leaves the dock, for instance to go fishing, they can leave behind a fender tied to the dock space and reclaim it when they return. By the way, you really need a decent dinghy to get around when you're cruising at Isle Royale. The distances within the anchorages can be in miles, and there's much to see and do. We took ours over for a visit with Duane and Mar on the motor cruiser Inisfree. The four of us were in a so-called bubble, having taken great care in limiting our contacts with other people. Of course, it's quite easy to observe social distancing when you're on a boat. At the conclusion of another delightful communal dinner, Vicki and I took our dinghy back to Freelance. It was well before dusk, which always makes the return run easier. And we didn't want to make it a late night anyway, because we intended to leave Chippewa Harbor for Windigo in the morning. The hook was up and we were underway at 7 a.m., with Vicki steering us towards the Narrows. Inisfree was still at anchor at the end of the basin. Duane and Mar would leave later in the morning, also bound for Windigo. We noticed there were 2 other cruising boats at anchor in the eastern cove when we turned into the Narrows at Rocky Point. One of the things we really like about Chippewa's back basin is that it has plenty of room for anchoring. You can have quite a few boats in here, but it never feels crowded. After passing through the Narrows, Vicki pointed Freelance towards the dock and to the channel that leads out towards the open lake. The morning was very quiet, and there wasn't any activity at the dock or campground when we passed them. The narrow S-shaped channel is challenging, but one we are quite familiar with. We have safely passed through it countless times, but we still have to be very careful here. If you should ever stand high up on the hill by the entrance and happen to look down on the entrance with polarized sunglasses, you will clearly see the jagged sides of the channel. They always remind me of the fangs in the open mouth of a giant beast reaching up from below. When we were well clear of the rocks, we made our final turn out towards the open waters of Lake Superior. To our dismay, we could see morning fog outside the entrance. As some of you know, Vicki and I both truly dislike fog, but this fog didn't seem to be too bad. Yeah, it's Lake Superior, you know. You get fog. The morning fog, which was more or less sea smoke, soon started to burn off, and we raised the main in anticipation of a pleasant day of cruising along the southeastern shore of Isle Royale. The weather forecast seemed to indicate it should turn into a good day for sailing, and we hoped they were right. Our course was set for our next waypoint off Glenline Shoal, which was just before getting to Menagerie Island and the Isle Royale Light, and on the outside of the huge Siskiwit Bay. The lighthouse at Menagerie is an octagonal white tower with a light at a height of 72 feet. It also has a house attached. When we pass by, we often think about the old-time lightkeepers and their families, and how it must have been living here before the light station was automated. We had been up early, and it wasn't her watch, so Vicki decided to rest below. Except for dodging some sports fishing boats, which were trolling along the contour lines, everything was routine. Hell, our autopilot and the GPS kept us on course. We were making steady progress, motoring at 6.5 knots. If you're wondering about our autopilot's name, Hal, it's named after the computer in the classic film 2001: A Space Odyssey. It had a mind of its own. Ours is, fortunately, far more stable. At noon we gave up on waiting for the promised sailing wind, so I went up to the mast and dropped the main while Vicki cranked in the sheet. There was still a ways to go to Cumberland Point Buoy, where we were to turn into Grace Harbor. The trip from the anchorage at Chippewa Harbor to Windigo is usually about 7 hours, unless of course you have to tack against the wind and waves. In nautical miles it's more than 45. When we neared Cumberland Point, the wind gradually increased from about 3 knots to 8 to 10 knots on the beam. And without the main up, we started to roll a bit in a developing chop from the southwest. The weather forecast had been right, sort of. It was just that the timing hadn't been in our favor. We rounded the buoy and headed towards Booth Island. On the northern side of Grace Harbor, where our preferred channel cut through the island chain into Washington Harbor. We were slowly making our way in the channel about 20 minutes later. It's one we are intimately familiar with, and we can safely pass through it with local knowledge piloting, but we strongly recommend using a bow lookout here. Like all the channels at Isle Royale, it should not be taken lightly. The rocks are unforgiving. We were now nearly at the end of our day's run, headed deep into Washington Harbor towards Windigo. As we usually do, we planned to approach the dock from south of Beaver Island. Vicki and I were again meeting up with our friends Duane and Mar of the motor cruiser Inisfree. They had sped past us earlier that morning off Harlem Reef. While we were still in Grace Harbor, I'd called them on the VHF, and they had told us Inisfree was tied up in their favorite spot on the north side of the dock, and that there should still be plenty of open dock space for Freelance when we would arrive. That was indeed good news, even though there's always plenty of anchoring space at the end of Washington Harbor. Vicki and I preferred to be at the dock. It's just more convenient. And there was indeed suitable space at the dock when we arrived. And as customary, other boaters, some of them other members of the Great Lakes Cruising Club, were on hand to take our dock lines and welcome us back to Windigo, where we planned to stay for a few days.